My name is Gary James, and I'm the owner of Cat's Paw Stained Glass here in Columbus, Ohio. And what I'm going to do is to explain to you a piece that I'm currently working on that is of, in my view at least, being that I do everything, including installation and initial contact for sales. So for me, by myself, this is a rather large piece. And as such, that's why we're making this video, so that I can explain to you how something like this is fabricated from start to finish. This is a section of a window. The entire window is actually about 6 feet by 6 feet. This section that I'm working on right here is about 4 feet by 4 feet. And this is making up the main picture of the window. And it is of the hill country of Texas. I'm working with a couple who are building a retirement home there as we speak, and this is going to be the focal point of their home. So what I'm doing today is showing you some basic cutting of pieces that I'll be doing on this window, and explaining the selection of the glass that I have for it, how I'm using the light box which this is laying on so that I can see my pattern to cut the pieces, some specialized equipment that I'll be using to cut the pieces, because some of the glass I'm using is rather frail and needs to be cut using a saw as opposed to by hand, and going on from there. This is a piece of glass that I've already cut for this window. It's a nice golden color. It's handmade by a company in Pennsylvania by the name of Yakagani. It's made on the basis of a Tiffany reproduction glass. What they did was they found some of Tiffany's glass, did a spectral analysis on it to determine what kinds of chemicals and metals were used in it, and then experimented from there to come up with this, which is some of the finest Tiffany reproduction glass that you can get your hands on today. Anyway, it's because it's handmade, and because it has inclusions of various chemicals and metals in it, it is very finicky when it comes to cutting a piece like this, and especially when you're trying to cut very deep inside curves such as this. I can cut by hand the basic shape of this, but to do these deep inside crevices, I relied on this ring saw, which is a specialized saw for cutting stained glass. It's one of the tricks of the trade that you absolutely can't do without if you're going to be doing a lot of cutting of this very finicky reproduction glass. The next piece that I'm going to cut will be the adjacent piece of it over here, and as such I like to try to make sure that it matches up grain-wise and color-wise so that there's a logical conclusion across the from one piece of glass to the other. This glass is of the sky of a window that I'm doing here, and it's a sunset sky. So that's what I'm going to do now, is to set this piece on the light table adjacent to this piece and see if I can find some area that looks similar to what I just cut. And right about here looks good to me, meaning that this direction, the glass gets just a little bit too dark and dense of the gold color in this region, and it would look like an unnatural shift from this one over here. Okay, so once I find the area that I'm happy with, I can just line it up, pick up my cutter, move other things out of the way, and begin my cutting of this piece. This piece is adjacent to a tree trunk and tree leaves above and below it. So the first cut I'm going to make is just straight up along the edge of the tree trunk, just to get the rest of the piece away from the area that I'm working on. Now the next thing to do is to start tapping the back side of the glass from what I made the cut on. The cut weakens the surface of the glass, and then tapping on the back side completes the fracture through the thickness of the glass. I don't know if you can pick this up in the camera, but you can see the fracture beginning with where I'm tapping. And I want to tap just hard enough that the fracture runs the direction I want it to, following the cut, and not take off on its own somewhere else. Okay, and that looks like that was well behaved. It broke just where I wanted it to, so now it's just a matter of separating the two pieces. This is the piece that I don't want, and the piece that I do want, following right along the trunk of the tree. From here I can set this piece aside so that I can now dedicate myself entirely to working on this. So it's best always to try to cut as straight away from you as possible. So I shift the pattern constantly to try to allow for that. Let's see. So here's a straight cut here that I can make. Because this is a straight cut, all this requires just this one tap, and it should run right along where I need it to break. Now it's just a matter of breaking apart all the separate little individual pieces. And if you want to stop that. Now the rest of these cuts, this cut, some of it I know I can do. This cut definitely I'm going to do on the bandsaw because it's got some really deep inside curves to it, and some pretty steep ones too. This glass is a little bit more pricey because it's handmade, and as such I would rather use the bandsaw than try to cut it myself. Although I'll cut some of this out by hand, but then I'll finish it up on the bandsaw. So I was able to follow the line in a fairly straight line, and now it comes to where I need a marking pen. What I'll do now is I will trace the line that I want to cut on the bandsaw, and of course especially this one. And then, so these white lines will be cut away now on the bandsaw. This piece is almost finished really now. All I need to do is take it over to the stained glass grinder, which is a diamond grinding wheel, and trim it up just in little places. There's a little sharp point right here that needs to be rounded. The same with over here and here. Here it's not within the bounds of the line, so it needs to be trimmed back here and a little bit along here as well too. And then this piece will be completed. The window that I'm currently working on is for a couple, clients of mine. They're building a retirement home in the hill country of Texas, but right now they're living here in Ohio. So what they wanted, what they told me what they wanted was a window that was going to be the focal point of their new house, which was rather flattering because they came to me for that. It was going to be in the very front of the house, a rather large window. The entire window itself was going to be about 6 feet by 6 feet, of which the major portion of stained glass of that was going to be about 4 foot by 4 foot, which for me, just by myself, is a nice-sized commission. I don't like to get too much larger than that. Otherwise, then I have to end up hiring outside sources, etc. So this is a project really that for the most part I'm handling, and I do have one intern who is helping me as well. There were certain specifications that they wanted this window to have. One was that they wanted 2 oak trees. They wanted it to be a scene of the hill country of Texas, which is where they're moving to. They wanted to have a lake in it. They wanted to have the bluebell flower in it. Blue bonnets, that is, the blue bonnets flower in it. So I did some preliminary sketches based first on talking to them about doing a painted foreground of blue bonnets with a stream coming down in the background, coming down from a lake, coming down from the hill country scene. And when I told them the price of the window estimated on doing this sort of hand-painted foreground, we decided to nix that right away. It was going to be quite outside of their budget to have that kind of work done. So we decided to go with having the use of the specialized stained glass, green and blue in color, to represent fields of blue bonnets in that area of the country. So my next task then, knowing that the glass was going to take care of the bluebonnet problem, was to find oaks. And that was rather problematic because I drew up an oak and I showed it to them, and immediately they said, well, that's a nice oak, but the oaks in the hill country of Texas don't look like that. They're more scrub oaks, they're more scrawny or wide-spreading oaks. And as such, I was stuck for a long time until I got the commission to do another job nearby. And traveling to that job, I found an absolutely gorgeous oak, the likes of which I've rarely ever seen in this area of the country, that looked precisely like the oaks that they were looking for. So I took my sketchbook out. I spent over an hour hand sketching this oak. I went out the next day with my camera and took photographs of it. And this is the oak tree that I found that met with their approval then. And this is the hand sketched oak that I did. And you can see that it's not a very full oak, but what it is, it's got enormous branches that hang way out. In fact, in the housing development where this is located, they built the road in a circular perimeter around this tree to leave it standing as the central feature of the housing area. So my next project then was to take this oak and put it into a stained glass window. This is an enormous oak and could be a stained glass window all unto itself. And I knew that couldn't be. So what I decided to do then was to take a part of the oak and use it as the foreground, and then have another oak tree, smaller, much smaller, in the background, which would then satisfy their idea of wanting 2 oaks. One oak would just be the large branches in the foreground with the foliage, and the other oak then in the background in full view, but very small. So I started doing thumbnail sketches. One day I sat down and I did about 7 or 8 different thumbnail sketches of what I thought might look nice in the project. And originally I thought maybe I'll put the 2 oaks together with the lake to the side. I didn't really quite care enough for that picture, so I went and I sketched out something else, which is showing, this was where we got the idea to go from here. The large oak leaves with the foliage in the foreground and the smaller oak in the background in hilly country with a lake up front. From that, another variation, getting a little bit closer perhaps. And then this was the final variation that I did that I was most pleased with. This is actually really showing the branches really up close. At this point, I still felt that I was a little bit too far away, not intimate enough with this oak tree to really show it off to its full majesty. But here, this is where I got the idea then, to actually show some of the massive trunk, to show some of these branches and how gnarled and crooked they are, and to show more globular shapes of leaf masses as opposed to individual leaves, and the pond in the foreground, and then the tree again in the center, which eventually ended up being moved over. And from that then I worked up 1 or 2 fuller sized scaled copies until I eventually was happy with that, showing that to my customer, getting the approval on an intermediate sized drawing that then I turned into the full scale size drawing, which is here in the background behind me. So this was the finalized window. You can see here we have the foreground, which will be some kind of sort of a green grassy area. We've got the rather strong trunk of this oak coming all the way up to the top with the rather interesting intertwining and crooked branches of it. The leaf masses, showing leaves up close to the trunk, leaves on the branches on the way out. The lake area, which is somewhat symmetrical, but then you have the secondary oak tree just somewhat off-center. He also wanted water lilies in this, so we've got water lilies now in the foreground, which, being that this is a work in progress, I have yet to really draw in the flowers of the water lilies, but that's not something that I had to do right away. What was more important was getting the general idea of this window down and approved by the couple. Technical aspects of this window then became an issue because it's basically a 4 foot by 4 foot square, and this kind of a window, this size of a window, can be a little bit wobbly, a little bit unstable. So at that point then I decided to break it down into a grid system. So these lines that run through here represent a grid of reinforced lead or zinc lines that will give structure and strength integrity to the window, and at the same time presents you with the feeling that you're looking at this scene from inside of a window. And there you have it. Then all the components fell in together and the window is on its way to completion. It's been several months since I was last on camera, as you can tell probably by my change of clothing. And the window is now at an intermediate step. I have proceeded to put together one panel of it after having make sure all the pieces are ground to fit perfectly, copper foiled, fitted them together, and then soldered it in place. And I've got it bounded by some reinforcing zinc. At this point in the window, I decided to approach a problem in a specific manner. At the bottom of this window, there's a lake, and in the foreground of the lake, there are lily pads with lily flowers. In traditional Tiffany style, the craftsmen at Tiffany would probably have cut every single individual petal of the lily flower and wrapped it with copper foil tape, making many different pieces. As you can see in this calendar that he would have done here, this is an up-close view of a window of a Tiffany, this being the window down here, and you can see the lily flowers in the foreground represented by individual pieces of glass cut for every petal. I decided that would be too much work and too much detail for such a small area, being that the lily flowers are going to be only on a piece of glass this big. So I decided instead to paint each lily flower, which you can do with stained glass paints. These are special paints made for fusing into the glass. These are not the oven bake-on kinds of paints that you might buy at a hobby store, but rather these are specific paints made out of ground glass and pigment, and then applied with a brush, finished up with a stylus, and then put in a kiln and fused into the glass at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. So I have my paints set up in front of me here. I'm just using what's called a Stencil Black, and they come in a powdered form, and you mix them with water and a little bit of gum arabic to make a paste-like consistency. Using a palette knife, I mix the paints in with the water. If you need more water, you add a little bit more water, a drop at a time. Once the paint has reached the consistency of, kind of like a thin yogurt, you can take your brush, dip the brush in a little bit of water, load up the brush with paint, and I'm going to use this calendar as a model for my lily flower. I have various lily flowers here available to me for that. And I'm going to begin painting this piece. And I think I'll start with some of the central petals. And the idea with the paint is to use it as you would, say, a crayon or a charcoal. Around the outside of the petals, you want to completely blacken in the glass. You want to completely blacken in the glass so that you see only the outline of the petals. And the black acts as a silhouette towards that purpose. Okay. Now I've completed applying the paint. What I'm going to do is carefully lift this up by its edge and hold it up to the light to make sure that I've completely darkened in anything, and any pinholes that might be showing, I then darken those in as well. Now this isn't done because you can see in some areas I've gone and smudged over a line or have drawn too heavy a line. So what we do now is to wait for this to dry. But on a piece that I have already finished, this is a dried piece, I can use a stylus, and the stylus can be made out of the sharpened end of a brush, or it can be also made out of an orange stick or a goose feather, a quill of that sorts. And now what I do is I will go in and using the sharp end of the stylus, I will draw and refine, scraping away the paint so that I get a water lily that is exactly the way that I want it to be. It's nice to use a stylus that is the end of a brush, because then you can brush away onto the paint so that you reuse it, the pieces that you, the sections that you've scraped off.
Yep.
You can turn the piece different ways to scrape different angles. After the piece has been scraped and it's where you want it to be, you can take the finished piece, and remember this glass is only permanent if it's fired in a kiln to 1200 degrees. I have a small kiln over here at the other side of my table. This kiln is made for the hobbyist or for the professional who wants to do small firings or test pieces of glass for fusing. So all 4 pieces will fit here on the kiln. The lid that then gets lifted into place over top. There's a small thermometer on the side of the kiln which registers in degrees from starting at 0 to 500 all the way up to 2000 and then some. For fusing I want to be, not for fusing, for painted glass I want to be right around the 1200 degree mark. And this is a kiln that's called rapid fire, and it's, as its name means, it will get up to this temperature probably within about maybe 10 minutes. I like to take a little bit longer in reaching that temperature so the glass isn't put under so much stress. So I'll probably, by turning the kiln on and off as a control switch, we'll get to the 1200 mark in maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. And when this is done firing, it will take probably the better part of 2 hours to cool down to a temperature. It might take closer to 3 hours, depending if I can vent it or not, depending. I can open it up a little bit at a time and allow the hot air to escape a little quicker, and that might cool it faster. And then when I'm done with that, then I'll take the pieces out, being that they're cooled, wrap them in copper foil, and get ready to put them into the piece for soldering. What we're going to do now is copper foil technique, and there's a couple of different ways to do stained glass. I think I've talked about those. Copper foil versus lead. This window is going to be using the copper foil technique for certain reasons. But after every piece of glass has been cut, ground to shape to make sure that it fits appropriately, it has to be wrapped in a piece of copper foil tape. They make the copper foil tape these days in nice little rolls like this. It has an adhesive side, the backing that peels away to expose the adhesive side, and then the side that it's not adhesive, that is what the solder adheres to. In Tiffany's day, they would have made this by hand out of large sheets of copper foil, applying an adhesive of some kind of combination of beeswax to the back side of it, and then cutting it in thin strips to suit their needs. Nowadays it comes in different thicknesses, widths, mill thicknesses, and even different colors of backing, silver or black backing, depending on if you're using clear glass so that you don't show up the copper on the back side. And this one I'm just using the silver, the regular copper, since all of this glass I'm using is more or less opaque. You begin by adhering about a 1/4 inch section of the copper foil to one portion of the glass and immediately crimping it down on both sides. Then, through various tricks of sleight of hand and acrobatics with your fingers, by peeling back the backing, peeling off the backing, and sighting down the longitudinal axis of the glass and adhering the copper foil tape sticky side to the glass so that it sticks, bringing it all the way around and overlapping where you began, tearing the piece, or you could use a razor blade or a pair of scissors to cut it. Then the next step is to crimp it down along the length of the perimeter of the glass piece. You have to be careful because on the sharp edges here you can have a very sharp peak of copper foil sticking up that you need to be careful of. You can be cut by that. Once this has been crimped around, you can crimp it a little bit further by pressing it down into the table on both sides. And then the final part is to use a burnishing tool, which can just be a pen in some cases, or they sell special burnishing tools for stained glass, but I found that a pen works just as well. And you want to then burnish the copper foil to the glass, making sure that there's a real firm adhesion between foil and glass. And you want to do that on both sides, and then even around the perimeter as well too. And this piece is finished as far as copper foiling goes. It then goes back in its position on the pattern. There. And the next piece is ready to be done. This is a copper foil machine, one of several that are on the market. What this does is that with larger, more regular shaped pieces of glass, will center the copper foil on the edge of the glass for you in the middle of this arm. And as you continue to put pressure down onto this wheel, it will apply the copper foil, center it on the glass, and even do an initial burnishing of the copper foil for you, so that when all is said and done, ideally all you have to do then is burnish it, do a final burnishing of it. Again, this gets overlapped all the way to the very end. Okay. Now, this glass is irregular in its thickness, so in some sections it didn't take so well as I'd hoped. That's all right. I can just go back over it and burnish it down. All along through here and here, the machine did just exactly what I was hoping it would do. This is already centered on both sides. It's given a first burnishing. All I need to do is just touch up the areas that weren't crimped down, and then do a final burnishing on it. The nice thing about this machine is that it also strips away the paper backing for you, so that you no longer have to do this acrobatics with your fingers the way that I showed you in the other style. And this piece is done. This machine is very nice for, like I said, larger, straighter pieces like this, and in doing it more production. It'll take a lot less time to do these sorts of things, and that goes back in its place on the pattern. See a lot of blank pieces missing from this pattern, and the reason for that is that I've given them to my assistant Kelly, who is in art school, and he has an interest in stained glass, so he is helping me by copper foiling a lot of these pieces for me. The next thing will be when he gets those done in the next day or two, I'll bring all the pieces in, they'll all be put back on the pattern in their appropriate place, and the soldering will begin then. And after the soldering begins, I'll try to get this soldered as fast as I can, because some of the chemicals used in soldering are corrosive to the glass. Not terribly so, but enough that you want to do this in as quick a time as possible. Then after that, cleaning, patina, and polishing. Then the piece will be finished. Okay, we're back again, and as you can see, the entire window is all together. I have all the pieces are cut out. All the pieces have been ground fit to fit, copper foiled, put in place. And I began the soldering process. And I have a small section of soldering here that I can show you how to do that. But for the most part, this front side of the window is nearly finished. I've still yet to, so to speak, cap off the very top of it with a zinc border like this. And once I do that, then the next step will be to turn the entire window over and solder the entire opposite side of it. There's several things you'll need when you're doing soldering. The first is obviously a good quality soldering iron. Some kind of stand to put the iron in, because these things do get awfully hot. A temperature controller to help control the heat that the soldering iron is putting out. Solder. Solder comes in various quantities and qualities. I use typically a 60% tins, 40% lead solder. It comes in 50%, 50%, and other variations too. This is something that is useful in cleaning the tip of the soldering iron, because it will, being so hot, oxidize rather easily when it's exposed to the air. And then lastly is flux. And flux is a chemical. There's all different kinds of fluxes on the market. Basically, flux is a chemical that allows the solder to flow properly and easily onto the copper foil, and it's an absolute necessity. You can't get along without it. So anyway, now that I've explained all that, I'm ready to start soldering this section here, and I start by fluxing several linear inches of copper foil tape, and then proceeding with the soldering iron, melting the solder to the glass with the iron as I go along. This is what's called drawing a bead, and you have to get right down onto the glass surface with the soldering iron for the proper flow of the solder. Typically, while I'm doing this, I have a couple of HEPA air filters that are running to help absorb the fumes that the solder puts out, because this product, obviously, the flux is made up of certain chemicals that are not all that great for the lungs, as well as the solder itself, being part lead, would be putting out some fumes too. But for the purposes of noise reduction for the videotape, I've turned those air filters off. Once you have soldered the sections that you have fluxed, you take some more flux and move on to the next sections that you want to do. You want the solder to form a nice bead, as I have mentioned, which means you want the solder to form a nice rounded surface to the top of it. Sometimes the solder, in filling in the crevices between the glass, will flatten out, as it is here. I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not, but anyway, this is a rather flat area of solder that then I want to go back over and make a nice rounded top to it. Sometimes it might take a little bit more flux to do that. You don't want to have the soldering iron stay in one place for any terribly long length of time, because it is so hot that it can and has caused what are called heat cracks, where the glass will suddenly crack on exposure to the heat of the tip of the soldering iron. That's relatively rare, though. You shouldn't be afraid of soldering just because of that. Okay, going along here. One thing, I'll show you a little bit of a tip that somebody showed me at one time. These spools of solder eventually run out, and you're left with a length of solder like this, which if you go through and use this up, you're left with a very teeny tiny little bit that's too hot to hold. You could use a pair of pliers to hold it, but that just doesn't really quite get it. So a nice thing to do is then to take the old solder and just solder it to the new solder, so that now you have no problem with holding that short little remains from the solder spool. Here you can probably see in the camera I have several pieces that are overlaying over top. These are going to be pieces that would be put on at the very last, after I've turned the piece over and soldered the backside. If I put them on now, they would put an undue uneven stress on the piece of glass and might cause cracking in this area. So these are little decorative pieces just to give a little bit more of a realistic effect of the tree and how the leaves stick out from it. Here I have some small pieces of wire that I've cut that I'll be using to indicate small twigs growing in through the tree mass. And worried about. The main thing is to know that it can be fixed and that there are ways of fixing. I'll show you what happens to an area if there is no flux applied to it. So I haven't applied any flux in through here. And as you can see, the solder just kind of clumps and sticks to the glass itself instead of the copper foil. You don't want it to do that. Solder doesn't stick to glass normally, so when I reflux this area and go back over it with the soldering iron, you'll see that the solder flows right back into where it should be, which is on the surface of the copper foil. You try to, as best you can, blend in one area of solder with an area that has already been done. You can do this by simply touching and lifting, touching until the solder in that whole area melts, and then lifting straight up, allowing the solder to blend in with the area that's previously been done. There is potentially a couple of steps to soldering. Certainly, the first thing you want to do is to allow the solder to flow down in between the gaps between the glass, so you want to take your time and fill in those first, and then sometimes it's necessary to reflux and go back over that area to build up the bead. Or if you can do all of that in one step, form the bead and fill in the solder, then that's certainly okay too. Well, we're back for the last wrap-up of this window, which has been now completed. The last stage that I did, which was patina, which is a chemical coloring agent that turns the solder lines into dark black, is a fairly simple process, so we didn't include that on the videotape. After patina, then the cleaning process came, and actually even before that I applied 1/4 inch reinforcing bars here along the length and along the top and bottom down here, just to make sure it had more support to it that it needed. And so this is the finished product, and it's going to be ready to be shipped off to Texas, where it'll be installed.
Good.
At this point, I'd like to introduce Kelly Martin. Kelly is a student enrolled in Industrial Design program at Columbus College of Art and Design, and Kelly was extremely important in helping me out in this project, and I certainly want to give him the credit for that. Kelly was actually cut a lot of the pieces that you see up here on the bandsaw, as well as he copper foiled most of the pieces and acted as a sounding board for ideas that I had on how to build this when it came to decision points. So he's extremely valuable to me in that sense, and I wanted to introduce him and say thanks as well to Kelly. And that's really about it for this. Now all that's left is to keep my fingers crossed, say a prayer that it gets to Texas in one piece, and then install it down there. Thank you very much for watching.